Okay, hello. This is the first webinar of a series of events planned in the Scottish Civil Society Data Partnership project. I'm Paul Lambert from the University of Stirling, and we're recording this webinar at the University of Stirling. Alongside me is Alasdair Rutherford, who's the principal investigator of the project.
Hello, welcome to the webinar.
So what the Civil Society Data Partnership project itself tries to do is explore opportunities for exploiting research data about the third sector, about civil society, in particular in the Scottish context. Sometimes that involves looking at data that civil society organisations have. Sometimes that's other data out there that might be available for research use, or that people in the communities interested in research in civil society might want to use, such as survey data sets, social survey data sets, administrative data produced for other reasons, for example. The 10 webinars that we're running in this program are all intended to explore different aspects of data resources and what they can contribute to exploring and answering research questions about civil society in contemporary Scotland. For each webinar, we're recording it live, and there'll be a few people participating live in each webinar, we believe, who will perhaps ask questions as the webinar goes on. There's an opportunity to post queries in the chat space, for example. We also imagine a number of people might watch the webinars subsequently. After we've completed recording, the webinar will be available for other people to watch back. And so if you are one of our live participants, if you're watching this as we speak on Thursday the 3rd of March in the afternoon, Do bear in mind that if you post comments or contribute to the session, it's being broadcast publicly and being recorded too. So think through what you say or don't say about yourself individually in that respect. So we'll begin with our first webinar, which is one of a few of the events that's on the theme of dealing with data, understanding what data is and how you can use it. And today's session, today's webinar, we've given it the title, Defining Big Data and Research Opportunities in Studying Civil Society with Secondary and Administrative Data. And what we're wanting to explore in this session is what we mean by this concept of big data that many people are quite excited about, and how it can be used to address research questions related to civil society. There's several different forms of data that are relevant here that might be called big data or have characteristics linked to big data, administrative data, survey data, other sorts of things. And what we'll be doing today, and actually in each of the webinars that we're doing, is we've got a number of pre-recorded talks contributed by members of the project team here on components of these questions, and we're going to be broadcasting them and then coming back for a little bit of time to potentially take questions or discuss further what comes up in the talks. So in a moment we're going to broadcast the first of those talks, which is by Alasdair Rutherford. Whilst the talk is ongoing, if you're watching, as you're following the seminar, you may also want to pick up the actual underlying slides that are being shown. For example, display quality. If you're wanting to pick up a URL or small reference made within one of the slides, you can do so from the thinkdata.org.uk website. But other than that, it should be hopefully possible to just sit and listen to each of these recorded tasks. And with that, we'll move seamlessly to the first of the presentations. What is Big Data by Alasdair Rutherford.
We'll start by thinking about what we mean by the term big data. It's a popular term and is widely used in the media, but it can mean different things to different people. There's really not any agreed upon definition. So I'm going to talk about some of the characteristics of big data and what they mean. If you've worked with data before, you might be saying, what's the big deal? So we now have lots more data, but haven't we been managing and analyzing data in different forms for a long time? How is big data different? In many ways, big data is not different. A lot of the same principles and methods for working with data still apply. What has changed is the sheer quantity and complexity of the data available and our ability to connect it together. Data has also become an integral part of our everyday lives, with many more of our daily living being recorded either actively, for example through social media, or passively, for example through mobile phone data. Our definition of big data needs to capture this changing role of data, as well as the scale and complexity of working with it, and if possible, to cut through some of the hype. So how big is this data really? It's big, right? Big can mean different things to different people. Big data is often said to mean data bigger than can be processed routinely with conventional computers. But the challenges of working with big data are not just technological. So big data doesn't have to be huge. It can be complex and challenging to work with, given the technology, people, skills, and resources that are available to you. Data that is big for one organization could be small for another. So in terms of its size, we're taking quite a broad definition of big data. There isn't a single set definition of big data, but there are some common characteristics that can help us to understand what we mean by the term. These are the 5 V's: volume, variety, velocity, veracity, and value. Firstly, volume. Volume means how massive amounts of data are collected and stored. Big data is large, it's unprecedented in scale and scope, but there isn't a precise definition for how big big data has to be. In the emerging field of data science, the data that is collected and analysed is so large that storage itself can be a challenge, never mind processing and working with the data. But in practice, in many other disciplines and organisations, the sorts of storage challenges aren't just because the data is large, but also because of its complexity and how it has to be accessed and how it has to be secured. But even more traditional social survey datasets can contain information on hundreds of thousands of individuals, particularly where that data is being gathered over time. And while that data is big to an extent, in terms of large numbers of people, it's also big in terms of being wide, having lots of different variables. And so the analysis and the structure of that data can still be quite challenging. But it's not so big that it can't be analysed with conventional desktop computers. Variety represents the different types of information that can be held as big data. And we mean variety in two different ways. So firstly, big data can contain large amounts of different types of information about each individual in the dataset. So there's a variety of information. But secondly, there are more different types and different sources of big data available than there were before. For example, social media data such as tweets or Facebook, healthcare data, video content, and data captured from wearable devices. Variety can also apply to the different structures of the data. That data held in big data sets doesn't necessarily have the more standard database structure that more traditional data sets could have. Velocity represents the speed at which big data is generated and can be analysed. Technological advances mean that a number of data sets are generated in real time and potentially can be analysed in real time. Much of this data is generated by the increase in digital devices that we all carry, phones and tablets and so on, that are generating data about our activity and our movements in real time. Organizations such as Facebook and Google use data science to analyze this data in real time in order to make decisions and serve content live in response to the data that is being generated. In practice, many organizations aren't going to collect or want to react to data at quite that speed, but velocity still represents the fact that there is an increased demand for intelligence generated quickly from the data that an organization has. And so there is still pressure to generate information quickly about recent activity, even if it's not up to the minute real time. Veracity refers to the fact that the data hasn't been collected for research purposes. It's data generated from undertaking an activity or from real-time measurement of some movement or some phenomenon, or from the administrative records created by an organization as they carry out their work. This means that the data can be generated in different ways, that it may have errors or mistakes or duplicates, abbreviations, and its own way of being coded and organized that isn't exactly how we might want to work with it as a researcher or as an analyst. But on the other hand, data generated in this way may well be more complete. It may cover the whole of a population, all the service users that an organization works with, for example, rather than just the sample generated from a survey. And so some would argue that the large quantity of this data can make up for some of the issues in quality or accuracy or of how the data has been collected. The fifth V, value, is added to the previous four Vs as the justification for working with big data in the first place. There has to be something in it for the organization, and so value is the value of the intelligence that's generated from being able to analyze the data that you hold from your organization and perhaps linked with other data sources. It might be that you want to be able to demonstrate the impact of your work to show to funders. Or it may be that you want to analyze where and how your services are being delivered in order to improve the design and delivery of services in the future. But there has to be something at the end of the day. We're not just analyzing data for data's sake. The 5 V's help us to think about the characteristics of big data, but it's also helpful to think about the types of data that we might include within that term. And we can think of broadly 3 types of data. There's human-sourced information coming directly from individuals, traditional business systems, the sort of administrative records and databases held and maintained by organizations in the course of their work. And there's machine-generated data, like the positioning of mobile phones. And these are all examples of large, unstructured data sets that are quite different from the conventional databases with records that we may be used to working with. Examples of machine-generated data include satellite images, weather data, maps, and so on, scientific data collected from natural phenomena such as earthquakes or the state of the atmosphere, and photographs and video collected from CCTV or traffic monitors that tell us something about activity in the world. Human-generated data could include the textual data, essays, reports, doctors' notes, open fields in a database, or social media activity, connections between people and what they're posting on social media. And then more broadly, website content, which could include text, video, and images, and could be data about a service or an organization. Increasingly, under the banner of big data, we also have access to structured data in the form of administrative data generated by organizations. And these can often be information about individuals. For example, health records, hospital admissions, education records, qualifications, income and pension records, organizational data about employers or about charities, and internal data about service users held by an organization providing a service to people, about the characteristics of the individuals that they work with. And these are all examples of structured data collected for the purposes of conducting the business of an organization or providing a service, but which can usefully be used for research and analysis. But big data isn't all advantages, and there are significant challenges in preparing data for analysis. These challenges have always been around, but they're particularly pronounced when we have large data sets to work with. You need to understand the structure of data, how variables are coded, how accurate the information is, what data is missing, and what the different terms and values in the data mean. If databases are large, then you might bump up against some of the limits of storage and processing power that your organization has access to. And you also, particularly when you start linking data sets, need to think carefully about issues of privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, and how these affect the subjects of the data that you hold. In our project, we're taking a broad view of big data. We include the increasing opportunities to make better use of organizational data and the benefits of linkages with external data. Our focus on data skills is to help enable you to make better use of the data that is becoming available. So this involves understanding the data that your organization generates, large and small, structured and unstructured, and how it might be used. Data can be big as a result of combining or linkage with external data sources, even if the core data that you start with isn't that big. And this linkage might be at the individual, at the organizational, or geographic level. Lastly, we're focusing on the value of big data, understanding the potential and the limitations of the insights that better use of your organization's data can provide, whether it's understanding the distribution of your work or trying to capture impact.
Great. So I hope you found that interesting. A very thoughtful presentation by Alasdair on the idea of big data. I should say, by the way, for those of you that are watching this session live, if you want to post comments or query anything, you need to follow the link through to the YouTube broadcast of the of this webinar. If you go along to our website, thinkdata.org.uk, you'll see a link you'll see an image of the webinar that you can actually watch from the web page. But unless you click the subsequent link to go through to YouTube, you won't have the other interactive materials, such as the opportunity for commenting and so forth on the site there. Alasdair's talk then was reflecting on the idea of big data in itself, which is well worth spending some time reflecting on, because it's quite a hot topic as a research resource or a theme for what we can do with data across all sorts of different sectors, not by no means just in the third sector and civil society, but across different areas of social life. There's also actually quite some opportunity even for funded research, exploring big data research opportunities. And sometimes for people working in third sector organizations interested in research, sometimes by connecting to themes of big data, that might be an opportunity to secure a small amount of income to do some particular research or methodological exploration, for example, of big data. We're hanging on just for a minute or two to see if any queries come through the YouTube site. If anybody is asking for clarification, Alasdair's sat here and primed and ready to address difficult questions about big data. One observation I think we could explore a bit further. Something that some of you may have heard of people discussing in the context of big data is the claim that as we move to larger scale data resources, typically byproduct data on a much larger scale than would have been the case with deliberately collected research data about something. But it's sometimes said that as we move to much larger scale data resources, we stop having to worry about the accuracy of the individual records to anything like the same extent. Several people writing books and articles about the phenomena of big data have claimed that one of the great efficiencies of big data is that we can more or less forget about quality control in collecting the data in the first place, because at the end of the day we'll build up such a massive corpus of information that the minor perturbations, the small scale errors and so forth will diminish to nothing. They won't really affect the end product of the story. This is actually quite a scary message to people like me from an academic background who spend so much time worrying about the quality of data. But we often wonder if it's actually a realistic portrayal of what we should be thinking about when we're collecting and bringing together data for research purposes. So one question, and this is a question from me to Alasdair, one question on this theme is how realistic is that belief that we don't have to worry about quality control anymore?
Yeah, I mean, you do hear that point of view quite a bit, and I think I would disagree. I mean, you maybe have to worry about different types of quality issues. So if your big data covers a large proportion of your population, then you might be starting to worry a little bit less about sampling, about coverage of the population. But I think you really still need to worry about how the data has been collected and how it's been recorded. Is it collected consistently? When it's recorded, does it mean the same thing? Has that meaning changed over time? And we'll touch on some of these issues when we talk about administrative data in particular. I mean, the other thing that you hear is that big data means that we won't need statistics anymore to analyze data, because you'll just have you'll just have the truth from the data that's there. I mean, I would also disagree with that. I mean, we're still going to have to understand missing data, for example, and changes over time, and error in the data that we have. So I think there'll still be a place for statistics, no matter the size of the data set.
Mm. Yeah, no. and also the idea that sort of the scale of big data will sort of iron out random perturbations, random errors. That only really works if the errors are random, doesn't it? It's if the bias or the poor quality in data collection is non-random, which it usually is. If it's systematic in some way, it's overestimating or underestimating something, then the increasing the volume of systematically biased data doesn't do any good at all. You know, so I think also on that grounds there's a bit of an issue.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. I work quite a bit with hospital admissions data, and there you're quite reliant on how accurately the data was entered by the health professionals in the hospital at the time. And it might be reasonable to think that how accurately that data is entered is linked to how pressured they are, and so how urgent the conditions are, for example, which might mean that it's not random what sort of data is missing or what sort of conditions are under recorded. So you absolutely have to worry about that, even if there's quite a lot of data.
Yeah. Great. All right. Thanks. So as I say, we're just holding on a second to see if any questions or queries have come in from those people who are watching it. It's not entirely surprising that we haven't got any yet, because it's quite a big ask to get somebody to come in and put a question up publicly. But please do feel free to, if there's something you'd like to clarify. For the moment, then, I think what we'll move on to the next of our planned presentations. This is actually a presentation by myself on the theme of secondary survey data. Now, it's a slightly different style of presentation. I'm afraid it's not quite as polished as Alasdair's. It's a more academic presentation, which basically means it takes longer and has more pauses in it. But hopefully, there's some interesting materials in it. In any case, what I'm doing is introducing the idea of secondary survey data, relating it to big data a little bit, but also just highlighting aspects of it that are relevant to potentially using it as a research resource when studying civil society. So we'll move on to that presentation. Some of you following the webinar might in fact be aware that the same project, the Civil Society Data Partnership Project, we've already had a more extended workshop on the same topic of secondary survey data and its possible uses in research on civil society. That took place on the 25th of February. And we've got quite a lot of materials from that session that are available online, and you're encouraged to and welcome to pick up at any point that's convenient. We've got some slides and discussions, again, reflecting on secondary survey data, just as I'm doing here, actually. We've got a lab session with a workbook and associated guidance materials and downloadable files. And we've got some additional presentational materials, discussions on particular aspects of working in secondary survey data analysis. If you do go and have a look at the Think Data website, under events, you'll find the link to training workshops, CSDP training workshops. There's workshop 1 that we're talking about here. The title was Using Secondary Survey Data to Explore Civil Society, and various things available for you to download at your leisure. So, brief talk today on secondary survey data, what it is and why it's important or potentially important for people interested in civil society, in this case, in this context, in contemporary Scotland. Secondary survey data research based on secondary survey data is in an interesting position in the contemporary UK, in that it's quite exciting in that there's more and more high quality resources of a very good standard and capacity for doing research. At the same time, it's been around for quite some time. We've had secondary survey data resources archived and available for further research use from the 1960s, actually. So for some people, it's a story that's already been told, but for many, it's a very rich research resource that is actually often somewhat underused in contemporary research. By secondary survey data, and really I'm talking about secondary social survey data resources, we're talking about deliberately collected research data that's then made available for other people to pick up the data files for and do some analysis on. This research data, it's usually beginning from a requirement to undertake a survey for a government sponsor or a comparably large-scale agency. Most of the secondary survey data that's used by academic researchers, for example, will typically either be a major government survey or a survey that's actually undertaken and collected by a higher education institute, but itself is funded originally by government money. Secondary survey data really is a powerful research resource for a number of quality reasons. It's usually providing us with access to information which is of a much larger scale and wider scope than we could reasonably get our hands on by any other means. Typically, secondary survey data sets might cover tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individual survey interviews, for example, whether it's with people or whatever the subjects are. And it's also collected with the best quality resources in most instances. So well-trained, experienced interviewers typically conducting face-to-face interviews, high-quality sampling design teams working on the surveys, coming up with a sampling strategy, producing good quality data resources. I've put in my note here, data curation and documentation of these large-scale surveys is another high-quality feature of these resources. And what that refers to is the way in which information about the survey is preserved and made available for other people, the curation and organization of the data. There's long established practice for doing this in a useful, effective way. So if you are, as a researcher, picking up a large-scale secondary survey data set, you'll generally expect to get really quite well-documented and well-organized data as well. Another attractive feature of a lot of the secondary survey data is that they're often quite impressive, ambitious, complex designs to the survey itself. So lots of the secondary surveys are more than just a one-off cross-sectional snapshot of society. They may well be longitudinal, going back to the same people on more than one occasion and asking them comparable questions. They may have particular features designed to aid comparability over time or between place. They'll often have more ambitious or more exciting elements to their design. So alongside the good news that secondary survey data is of a very high standard, it's also an obvious point that it's a sensible way to proceed if you don't have so much by way of research resources. You want a high quality data resource for not much money. So the majority of publicly funded secondary survey data sets that are archived at something like the UK Data Archive are available free for non-profit research, or at a minimal cost, just an administrative charge sometimes. So it's a very efficient model of doing research. It's also scientifically appealing because if other people can access the same data resource, then you've got a transparency of research sources and perhaps replicability, the repeatability of research by other people. Also, another efficiency to the data is you effectively bypass complex ethical problems of accessing data, because this is usually dealt with at the original archiving stage, the depositing of the data at the first instance. And arguably, although not everyone experiences this the first time round, but arguably it's not so hard ultimately to do analysis with secondary survey data sets. There are certainly some rather specialist skills and abilities needed to do things with secondary data, but after a little bit of training or use of online guidance and resources, these are doable. These are something that most people in the social sciences are capable of undertaking. And these attractions and strengths of secondary survey data, they've been obvious for quite some time. There's writing on reflecting on the qualities of secondary survey data going back over several decades. The UK Data Archive, which is the primary hub for the depositing and distribution of data resources, was actually founded in the mid-1960s, and for quite a while we've recognized that there's a lot of useful information out there in the form of secondary survey data sets. An interesting contextual question in relation to today's short webinar is whether or not secondary survey data should be thought of as big data. There are different perspectives on this, and it kind of depends what you yourself think big data is, because people are by no means agreed. Certainly secondary survey data has many of the characteristics of big data. Certainly the scale of records, complexity, comprehensiveness of information across a range of different aspects of lives, and also the growth in the scale and content of secondary survey data over relatively recent time periods. We've seen a considerable expansion in secondary resources. All of these are very much in line with models associated with the big data characterization. Certainly, in my opinion, speaking as delivering this talk, I would certainly class secondary survey data. Excuse me, I wonder if I'm going to get through this recording with a cough. I would certainly class secondary survey data as a version of big data in that sense, but it is a resource that's deliberately collected for research purposes. And for some people, big data wouldn't have that characteristic. Big data would be a byproduct, something collected for some other reason, but that can then be used for research. And also, big data, of course, is generally associated with new innovations and developments in data resources. And of course, secondary survey data is lots of things, but it's not new. We've had it and been aware of its properties for quite some time. So depending on your framework, the answer is yes or no on whether or not secondary survey data should be thought of as big data. A few more reflections on secondary survey data resources. There is lots to get excited about if you're that way inclined to the developments and features of secondary survey data resources as research facilities. Basically, in the last decade or two, they've expanded steadily in their scale and scope and complexity, and also the quality of the data being recorded. And I'm trying to summarize that in a few points here. So that opens the doors in turn, for example, to a wider range of statistical analysis options applied to these data resources. certainly when you look at the research that's being done with some of the largest and most impressive secondary data sources and the statistical methods being used, they're quite ambitious and complex, and they're quite different to what was being done not that long ago, a decade or two ago, in terms of statistical analysis methods and techniques. Often these days, secondary survey data resources are actually linked and connected to other supplementary data, such as administrative data. It might be something from health records or even tax records or some way, obviously with careful attention to ethical issues and possibilities for accessing data. Sometimes even additional descriptive qualitative data is collected within large-scale surveys, so people might be asked to write out free text responses, write a paragraph of reflection on something, and that data can be processed and stored and made available, often in an interesting way. And an impressive feature of the accumulation of data resources is just the steady expansion over time in how much data researchers are able to get through this mode, through downloading in some way secondary survey data resources. An amazing example of this, I would say, is IPUMS, the International Public Use Microdata Series, which is funded by the US government. IPUMS refers to a number of different data collection and distribution projects, most of which are based on census data, but sometimes also other social survey data. IPUMS International collects data from many different countries, data from 560 million people and 258 censuses across the world, from about 70 different countries, if I remember correctly. IPUMS USA is census and socioeconomic data from the United States. North Atlantic Population Project, linked to IPUMS, is historical census data from the 19th century from a number of countries. All of this data, you can go to these websites and download extracts from the data in a very efficient and well-organized manner quite quickly. So you've got very powerful data resources to hand in one form or another. In my slide, I've put a brief note about one of the big UK secondary survey data resources, something called Understanding Society, or the UK HLS, UK Household Longitudinal Study. This is one of the biggest and most impressive of the contemporary large-scale social surveys that's available for secondary use at the current time. It's a very large sample with a panel element, which basically means re-interviewing the same people each year. The bulk of the people in the survey were first interviewed in 2009, but some of them were interviewed much earlier, actually in 1991, and have been interviewed annually since then. And the UK HLS is a well-organized, reasonably easy to use survey with some complex features, but readily downloaded and readily worked with information across a very broad spectrum of aspects of its respondents' lives, so socioeconomic issues, employment and so forth, leisure, lifestyle, behavior, attitudes and values, health, and biosocial features of people, things like their height and weight and other data about them. Amazingly rich information about the subjects of this survey makes it a very powerful resource in many respects, and it does have quite a bit of data about leisure activities, including things like volunteering, as well as employment activities in the sector of employment. There's many interesting research possibilities with this surveys. It's worth reflecting. I keep saying how great secondary survey data is for research purposes. It's worth perhaps admitting that not everyone is enamored with these data resources, and it's only perhaps a smallish proportion of social science research users that are working with these sorts of data resources. One limitation of some forms of secondary survey data work is that you can, of course, be a little bit constrained by the questions that were asked in the survey. You can't change things subsequently. Sometimes the measures and the structures that you would want to work with aren't quite there. You've got to use something a little bit suboptimal. I've put this image of data on volunteering from one of the big UK secondary surveys, the British Household Panel Survey. The quality of the information about volunteering in that survey is probably a little bit suboptimal. It's probably not the best way of finding out what people are doing. The proportions here are quite low, and actually lower than they might be from other sources, for instance. So you're a little bit constrained in the data resources. Sometimes as well it takes quite some time before a secondary survey data is available for reuse. It might be several years after the data is collected before you can get to it. Two more perhaps important points or interesting points about why people don't use secondary survey data. One is a more organizational thing about how social science is done. The same people who are potentially users of secondary survey data resources are also potentially users of other forms of big data resource. And some people believe that the days of secondary survey data are numbered, in that other forms of big data, byproduct data, should naturally replace these large-scale, high-quality designed survey structures. And that's open to debate. I don't agree with that framework, but some people do. But one of the consequences is some people are diverted from working with these secondary survey resources to work on other forms of large-scale data resources, big data structures, which does have the effect of less use of secondary survey data than you might expect. But I would say the most important reason why quite a few people are not using secondary survey data, even though it might be quite useful for their research purposes, is that it is a little bit challenging in a different way. It's large and complicated and does require a certain number of technical skills that don't look easy. And you're working with a data resource that you didn't collect yourself, you don't have a personal investment in it. It's a bit technical and abstract. I would certainly maintain that it's quite possible to become comfortable and efficient and effective in working with secondary survey data resources, developing relevant technical skills. But these are slightly challenging things to do in the first instance, so it's not surprising that a fair number of people perhaps turn away from these types of data resources when they might be productive for them. If you were thinking about actually getting hold of secondary survey data, the conventional model is to download information, electronic file of secondary survey data to your own local machine and analyze it on your machine. And if you're interested in doing that, you can go to, in the UK, the obvious place would be the UK Data Service, which is one of the major providers of these resources. It's not the only one, but it's perhaps the most important. And you'd be able to search across the data resources that they have at the UK Data Archive, and when relevant, find suitable resources and download them to your machine. This is, of course, a little bit challenging and does involve a few steps of research, which I try to summarize in these slides. Basically, you save a copy of the original data somewhere on your local machine, and because of the scale of the original data, you're nearly always using a software package to then open up the data and do some analysis on it. So secondary survey data is hard to do without a software package that's designed for this sort of task. We'll say some more in later webinar activities actually about qualities and features of different sorts of software and tools for analysis. But most people working in this way are opening files that are saved locally through software. And just as a little point of information, because secondary survey data resources are rather complicated things, when we use the software, it's generally important to have a good quality record of what we're doing with the software. And usually in the discipline of social science data analysis, most people achieve this by using what are known as command files or syntax to write out the commands that the software processes on the data in order to generate the outputs. So it's possible that you've got used to using software like this, but without this command file structure, when you are dealing with large, complicated secondary survey resources, it is much more preferable to be working in this manner with command files. Again, see our workshop on this topic for a little bit of expansion on this and some examples that you can have a look at if you're interested to. It is actually possible to take advantage of secondary survey resources without downloading and analysing the microdata in this way. It's well worth, if you haven't seen it before, it's well worth taking a look at Nestar, which is a tool for the online analysis of data, secondary survey data resources that are stored at the UK Data Archive. Again, there's some information on this within our training workshop. But Nestar is a system where you can identify the data set you're interested in and pick up a lot of information about records within it, including performing some limited online analysis of that data, producing tables and simple graphs based upon the analysis. There's lots of other things as well, and again, we've got some links of them to these in our workshop materials. Nestar it can be used for analysing microdata stored at national archives such as the UK Data Archive. But for example, one of many other comparable resources here is the OECD Gender Data Portal, which gives you summary statistics about, well, in this case, gender inequalities over time and for different countries. In this example, we've got the youth unemployment rate by gender and its trends over time, and more detailed patterns in France. So there are ways you can get to rich, high-quality social science information which don't involve downloading the survey and using software to analyse it. You can do it remotely in one way or another. And the other important point to say in introducing secondary survey data is that there's a lot of supplementary resources out there that can help you through the process if you're thinking of trying out some of these activities. There's all sorts of online resources such as statistics training resources, other courses and training materials that can be very helpful to you to find out about the process of downloading, analysing, getting high-quality research results out of secondary survey data. It is true, I would argue anyway, that the more extended training courses, the more productive ones. So sometimes if you are thinking of going down this route, it's not necessarily enough to participate in a one-day introduction and that's the only thing you ever do. But it can be more effective to sign up to a more extended training activity, a residential course that runs over a few weeks, for example, such as the Essex Summer School, or to enroll on some MSc course or something where you look at this topic over a more sustained period of activity. These are obviously, it's not a possibility for everybody, but these more sustained training engagements are often more productive. One of the reasons actually that the more sustained training model is sometimes preferable is because of the statistical analysis component of secondary survey data analysis. So mostly we're talking about using somewhat more advanced statistical techniques of analysis, and we're also generally talking about another sort of data processing activity or statistical processing activity, which is slightly separate to data analysis but is related. We often refer in the discipline to data management as the organisation of data, such as processing metadata, dealing with missing data, linking together data from different data resources. All of these things are readily done with software resources, but there's some skills in knowing how to do that and learning about the different possibilities which come into the training and capacity building options. And again, I keep cross-referencing the Think Data website and other things in our program, but we've got a number of materials on the web pages already or coming up on the web pages over coming weeks as we develop some materials that can give you some resources to help with these aspects of working with data. Okay, so hopefully you found that discussion of secondary survey data a little bit of interest. Trying to highlight some features of what secondary survey data means. Also providing you with an interesting opportunity to monitor the progress of my bad throat, which has evolved from when I recorded that to a bit more creaky as I'm speaking now. Just a reminder, if you want to pick up the individual slides used in those presentations, you can do so from our website. For example, if you wanted to follow some of the links or pick up on some of the cited references, for example, they're available from our website. And also a reminder, if you want to make any comments, if you want to chip in with any observations during our webinar, you're very welcome to follow the link through to YouTube from the thinkdata.org.uk website, and it's when you're in the YouTube channel that you have that opportunity to post queries and so forth. Well, perhaps it makes sense to move in the first instance to, we don't think we've got any questions coming through just yet, so we might move in the first instance to the next talk, which is going to be about what administrative data is. And then we'll pause there, perhaps for an opportunity for discussion. One of the things that might be interesting to reflect on is the difference between the secondary survey data and administrative data, and the pros and cons of both of them as data resources. But the next pre-recorded session that we've got lined up for you is back to Alasdair Rutherford and talking about what is administrative data and what do we mean by that in the context of research use.
So we've talked more generally about big data, and now I want to think about one particular form of big data, which we mentioned earlier, administrative data. Administrative data are data that aren't collected for research purposes, but instead are collected in the routine operation of an organization. So in the organization, management, delivery, or monitoring of the services and activities that organization carries out. And this data might be drawn from databases, from computer systems, from other records more generally. And it could include data about individual people, about services, about other organizations that you're in contact with, about the processes or the activities of the organization itself. But it's the routine data generated by the operation of an organization as it runs and as it goes about its everyday activities. Historically, there's been very little access to administrative data, particularly for researchers. One big exception being population register data in Nordic countries that has been more available. But over the past few years, the opening up of a range of public sector administrative data sets has really focused resources on the preparation, the linkage, and the analysis of administrative data. So we talked earlier about some of these examples, but individual health records, hospital admissions, education records, income and pension records, all sorts of organizational data generated by the public sector is increasingly being made available to researchers under strict conditions and confidentially and anonymously, but allowing them to conduct social science research using this administrative data. Beyond that, then, individual organizations have been making more use of their individual data on service users. So where they hold information about the services provided, there's been increasing use made of an analysis of that data that's generated in the running of even smaller organizations. Let's take a look at some examples of administrative data. Not all administrative data is at the individual level, and there's a lot of aggregate administrative data available to download freely. At the new website statistics.gov.scot, you can access a wide range of official statistical data, some of which is drawn from social surveys, and much of which comes from administrative data. So for example, here we can see different types of data organized by geography, by theme, by organization that holds the data, and we can select the one that we're interested in. So for example, we can choose labor force data. Within these themes, it shows the data sets that are available. We can choose the one that we're interested in. Perhaps we're interested in the numbers of people that are not in employment, education, or training. We get some information about the data here, the range of values, the years, the measures, the geography that it's available for, and we can choose what we want to see. So perhaps we're interested in the percentages. We choose ratio here, and we can see that it has created a spreadsheet for us which shows the percentage of young people aged 16 to 19 that are not in education, employment, or training by council area and over time. So we have a grid here, and we can see the percentage in each council area and in each year. So we can see differences across local authority areas, and we can see differences across years. Now this data can be downloaded as a spreadsheet, as a CSV, a comma separated variable file here, which would then allow us to do further analysis with it if we wanted. And so this data here comes from administrative data, and while behind it there is obviously individual level data about the young people, this aggregate data is available for different time periods and different geographical areas and accessible through this website. One of the great potentials for using administrative data is the ability to link data across different administrative data sets in order to get new insights into studying particular phenomena. And this has really been pioneered in the linkage of administrative health data, where it's been possible to combine individual records from different parts of the health system, hospital admissions records, prescription records, and so on, in order to understand patterns of service use. And that linkage is possible in health records because there are individual identifiers, anonymous identifying numbers that allow the same individual's records to be linked together and to be able to see patterns across different data sets. Increasingly, we've seen the linkage of different administrative data sets across organizations. So, for example, the linkage of hospital admissions data held by the NHS to social care data held by local authorities. So two different administrative data sets holding information on the same individuals, linked and then analysed anonymously to understand patterns of service use across different types of services run by different organisations. In addition to linking administrative data sets themselves, there's also potential to link administrative data to other social survey data. So, for example, the existing secondary social survey data that's been collected from the labour force survey and other social surveys like that, to administrative data records to give more insight beyond the self-report contained in social surveys. And then the third development in using administrative data that we've seen is the potential for individual organizations to link the data that they hold to broader administrative records in order to measure outcomes. So that might be linking individual service user data to health records to look at health outcomes following an intervention that allow a better measure of impact than just the data collected by the organization itself. Of course, working with administrative data brings its own set of challenges. And the key feature of administrative data is that it hasn't been collected for research purposes. So the databases haven't been designed with research or the researcher in mind. So individual fields might be unused, the coding in the database might be inconsistent, the data might not be well documented, and the criteria for inclusion or exclusion, who's in or out of the data set, might not be that clear. There's also likely to have been changes over time. Perhaps definitions of the codes and terms and variables in the data may have changed. Particular variables might have come into and out of use over time. And the structure of the data itself might have changed as the organization developed, new services were added, and the data was being used for different purposes. If you want to use another organization's data, then you're going to need permission to use that data. And depending on the data source and the sensitivity of that data, that might be straightforward or it might be time-consuming. For example, applications to link data to individual health records require really significant oversight and scrutiny before being approved and are likely to have a lot of conditions placed on them because you're working with some quite sensitive data. If the admin data that you want to use is your own, if it's your own organization's, then that's much more straightforward. But you still need to ensure that you have the right to process that data for analysis. Linkage is a really powerful application of administrative data, combining data from different sources. But if there isn't an individual level ID, then accurate linkage requires quite a lot of individual information, such as names, addresses, and dates of birth, and you won't always have access to that level of personal information in all the data sets that you want to combine. Of course, you also need to think about the ethical and privacy implications of combining different data sources that haven't been collected for research purposes. There have been several large developments to support and encourage the use of administrative data for research purposes. And these have really been supported by the increased desire of many data holders and the public sector in particular to make more of their data available and to facilitate access for researchers. Most recently, the Economic and Social Research Council invested a significant sum of money in the Big Data Network. This has 3 phases and has made investments in a number of areas to support the wider use of a range of administrative data sets. The Administrative Data Research Network focuses on supporting access to government data. And the Administrative Data Research Centre for Scotland is located at the University of Edinburgh. There are facilities to support requests to access data. There's a number of activities to build capacity amongst researchers and organisations wanting to work with administrative data held by the government. And there are facilities such as the safe haven in which sensitive data can be accessed securely by researchers. The second phase of the Big Data Network focused on business and local authority data and funded a number of centres around the UK. The University of Glasgow hosts the Urban Big Data Centre, which focuses on bringing together administrative data and wider big data sources to understand urban challenges and the analysis of activity in cities. They also support access by researchers from academia, the public sector, and the third sector who want to use big data and administrative data in their work. And phase 3 of the Big Data Network funded 4 civil society data partnerships, of which our Think Data project is one. And we exist to build capacity amongst third sector organisations in Scotland to work with a wide range of data, but including administrative data, and in particular to make better use of the data that those organisations collect themselves in the course of their work. We're also doing some work with administrative data about the Scottish third sector, with preparing organisational data in order to try and capture the spread and the characteristics of third sector organisations beyond just the charity data held in the Scottish Charity Register. So we've seen just a brief introduction to a broad range of administrative data and discussed some of the potential in being able to access large quantities of data about service use and combine different data sets together in order to get better insights from the analysis of that data. We've also briefly touched on some of the challenges of working with administrative data, and you can contrast them with the benefits and challenges of working with social survey data that we heard about earlier.
Great. So that was an exploration of what administrative data is, or byproduct data, data that's produced for other purposes. Exploring different forms and structures of administrative data, and also Alasdair was highlighting a few things about data resources specifically in Scotland. As it happens, we live in a country where there really is quite a lot of opportunity for accessing byproduct administrative data, potentially for research purposes. Quite a lot of possibilities and things that can be done with different forms of administrative data. One of the ongoing themes in thinking about research opportunities and research methods and data resources are the relative differences between the larger scale social survey resources, the secondary survey resources, and administrative data resources as research instruments. Most people working in the area tend to have a view that whilst on the face of it they have quite similar qualities, in both cases they're large numeric data sets that you analyze through statistical analysis to find patterns of difference, they do have some fairly different qualities in different ways. Some people have used that one type of data is much better than the other, or vice versa. And we heard in the earlier discussion, for example, of big data and on secondary surveys, sometimes the idea that the time of deliberately designed social surveys has potentially passed, because big data resources or byproduct data resources, administrative data, potentially can do the same things as surveys, but do not need the expense of collection. This is very much a disputed position, and people that are perhaps committed to survey research would typically argue that aspects of surveys that are important over and above administrative data are the wide range of measures that will typically be recorded in surveys and allow you to ask more complicated questions or explore more complicated patterns in data than the small number of things that you get typically in an administrative data set. Also, the modes of access to secondary survey data will often be more streamlined. So survey data sets were generally originally collected for the purpose of analysis. So they're people in the system trying to make them available for other researchers. Whereas with administrative data, it can sometimes be a bit more of a struggle, because there's more work sometimes needs to be done to make arrangements to get access to the data. But there are some significant attractions to many of the administrative data resources, as Alasdair was highlighting across a number of different sectors. One point of reflection for us thinking about third sector and civil society research is how that debate about strengths and weaknesses of survey data versus administrative data plays out when we're thinking about finding out about civil society, there are some things about civil society that maybe aren't covered by social surveys, for example, that might be in administrative data sets. There are some modes of access and working with data that work perhaps in slightly different ways for people that are associated with civil society organisations. Again, just in discussion and reflection, I've got Alasdair still here sitting beside me, and Alasdair's particularly well positioned in this respect because he's used both survey data and administrative data for this sort of research. So one initial follow-up comment or question for Alasdair. What's your perspective on the trade-off between administrative data and survey data when thinking about analysing civil society?
I mean, I think as we've heard, there's advantages and disadvantages to each type of data. They're going to answer slightly different questions and in slightly different ways. So it can be useful in taking it, giving us different perspectives in addressing a research question. I mean, I think some of the greatest potential is in linking survey and administrative data, and in some sense getting the best of both worlds, and then having the richer characteristics about activity, but linked to some of the service use information in administrative data. So I think that can be relevant for thinking about civil society, where, as the example that I gave, we might want to use social survey data on volunteering, where we're interested in a lot of the characteristics of individuals that we can get from a social survey. But we also might want to link that to some sort of information about organizations, which the individuals aren't necessarily going to have the information to report in the answer to a survey, but where we might have a good administrative record about types of organizations and their distribution. So by combining that, we can get a bit of the best of both worlds. Of course, that can be challenging. It can be more but problematic getting permissions and thinking about privacy concerns when you're combining anonymous administrative data and then having a linkage to some survey data that might be a bit more disclosive.
Yeah, it is, and it's quite a lot to ask for an individual researcher, but this is also one of the areas where collaborative activity can pay off, because if you've got a team of researchers and in the context of this discussion, perhaps some people who are in third sector organisations, some people who are in academic institutions, that perhaps gives you the capacity to do that more ambitious sort of high quality data and research.
Yeah. I think that's right, and particularly where organizations might hold some administrative data themselves that they're wanting to get more out of, collaborating with somebody who has the expertise in that, both working with that sort of data but also linking it to other types of data and getting insights from that combination can make the collaboration really powerful.
Yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. Okay. So we've got one more scheduled presentation in today's webinar, and it actually follows very nicely from that discussion, because Orian Brook, who's also part of the Civil Society Data Partnership Project, has done a recording reflecting on some examples of research using big data sets in different formats for third sector research. So we'll move then to broadcasting that presentation by Orian Brook.
So we've heard previously in this webinar about the different kinds of large data sets that are available for third sector research. And now I'm going to be talking about some examples of different types of research that have been done with different types of data, roughly within the realm of third sector research. If you haven't listened to Alasdair Rutherford and Paul Lambert talking about the different types of big data set that are available to us as researchers, then it's well worth having a listen to those sections of the webinar. So, but just a quick recap, for the purposes of this presentation, the big data sets we're talking about include survey data, the kind of large government surveys usually that spanning many years that have now built up very substantial, high quality, very complex in terms of the depth of the data that they collect. And then we're also talking about administrative data that might be public or private data sets, for example, pupil census, the UK pupil census, for example, GP registrations or pensions data. Obviously, there are different issues about access to different types of data here, including commercial records, but they're all highly structured databases, normally collected for purposes other than research, but very well maintained, well documented data sets, and or to some extent documented data sets. And then there are big unstructured data sets, maybe that are more commonly talked about in the wider world in terms of big data, like social media, for example, Twitter and Facebook. Also digitalized text, for example, all of Hansard has now been digitized, so there's potential to analyze that. Or there are now online media databases, Newsbank and LexisNexis, where you can analyze newspaper articles and look at media coverage and do textual analysis of that kind of things. Or, for example, GPS records. There are now people using GPS records to track, for example, where potholes are in roads, or to track cycle routes taken by people using bikes in particular cities. So the first example I'm going to talk about today is one that's been conducted by Professor Nick Bailey at the Urban Big Data Centre in the University of Glasgow, who's one of our associate organisations, one of the other strands of the administrative data funds given out by the ESRC. And they have been working with the Administrative Data Research Centre at the University of Edinburgh, which is also funded by the ESRC Administrative Data funds, to do anonymous linkage of highly sensitive data. They are looking at the benefits data and looking at people whose benefits have been sanctioned. And although sanctioning used to be, in previous years, a rather rare occurrence, but most recently its use has been dramatically increased, supposedly as an incentive to get people applying for more jobs or get people turning up to appointments on time and so on. And what they're doing is linking this data to the pupil census. It's UK-wide data in both cases. There are roughly 570,000 people on income support whose benefits were 500,000 people on income support, 100,000 of whose benefits were sanctioned in the most recent period. This has been linked to the pupil census to look at the children of people whose benefits were sanctioned, to look at the, one assumes, unintended consequences of this benefit sanction on those children in terms of their school attendance rates, in terms of any behavioural issues, for example, school exclusions, and also on their exam results. And there's a link there if you want to find out more about this data. It hasn't reported any results yet. A second example is one that is actually also part of the Scottish Civil Society Data Partnership, which is a Milo database. This is a database which is managed by the Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations on behalf of all the third sector interface organisations and the volunteering coordinating organisations across Scotland. They use Milo to record any volunteering opportunities that come up, or any volunteers that come to them looking for places to volunteer, and also to record any support that is given to third sector organisations. And that carries approximately 35,000 voluntary organisations. In comparison, the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator, the OSCR database, has about 24,000 records. That has previously been used to analyse the third sector in Scotland, but it has some disadvantages. It only represents registered charities, so not smaller organisations, but also it only has the registered office of the charity, their legal office, so it will tend to report that there is a charity based for, it's more likely to report that it's based, for example, in Glasgow or in Edinburgh, where their solicitors officers might be, for example, but it's going to underrepresent locally based activity, especially where you have, for example, the Red Cross or the Girl Guiding Association or whatever, who have many much more local activities going on than their central office would tell you about, and also, of course, for example, the charity shop network. So we, or I, primarily are engaged in cleaning this database, looking for duplicates, looking for errors in the way that some things may have been recorded. I'm also looking at coding, the types of activities that the organisation is involved in, using an internationally agreed coding scheme to look at, for example, if they work with disabled people or with addictions or with young people, or if it's a play group or and so on. And this will then be made available to researchers who are interested in understanding the third sector in Scotland, and we hope that it might provide an improved, or at least a different view of the third sector, and especially valuable looking at activities at a local level and a more geographically detailed level than has been previously possible. So a third example is a colleague of ours, loosely speaking, the Third Sector Research Centre based at the University of Birmingham, and Dega Camarada has been analysing the Understanding Society survey, previously known as the British Household Panel Survey, which I believe Paul was telling you about in his section of the webinar. As he mentioned, it's not necessarily the best source of data on volunteering, but it is very high quality, longitudinal panel survey that's been going for many years now, and Dega's used this to look at how participation in volunteering varies, or rather how our understanding of participation in volunteering within the population varies once you look at it longitudinally rather than cross-sectionally, i.e. year by year. So to look at this in more detail, we can see that in any 1 year we have roughly half the population or half of respondents seem to be involved in with voluntary associations, or active with voluntary associations in some way, which one might report as saying, yes, about half the population is involved in volunteering. However, if we look at this same data on volunteering year by year, you can see that on the left, in 1991, that's roughly half the sample is volunteering, that's in black. The grey part of the graph is not volunteering, that's in grey. But then you look at the next wave on the graph, which is 1993, and then you can see that some of those who were volunteering in 1991 are no longer volunteering. But then more than that, of those who were not volunteering in 1991 now are volunteering, and so on. So, and the same again in 1995. Some of the people who stopped volunteering in 1993 are now back again, and some of those who were volunteering in 1993 have now stopped, and the same with those who were not volunteering originally. So by the time we get to 2007, which was the last wave of data used in this analysis, you can see that in fact there's only a very small proportion of the sample who had not been active in voluntary associations in any time during the time period of the sample. And likewise, there's only a very small proportion, perhaps an eighth of the sample, that had been consistently active in voluntary associations throughout the lifetime of this data. And this paints a very different picture about activity in terms of voluntary associations, and whether there is indeed a large pool of people who are not involved in volunteering who might be recruited to volunteering. It seems like there's actually very few people who are not involved in volunteering at all, and many more people who are dipping in and out of volunteering. And it seems from Dega's analysis that in fact people are not necessarily dipping in and out of the same volunteering, so they're getting involved in different kinds of activities in different years. And that provides a different challenge if we're thinking about wanting to increase participation rates in volunteering. So the fourth example I'm talking about today is, in fact, formed part of my PhD, which is looking at cultural participation in Scotland. This is something that's previously been understood using survey data, often by sociologists or by funders of culture, which might tell you a great deal about the participants and maybe something about their motivation for attending theatre and museums and art galleries and so on. But it tells you very little detail about how often they attend, about where they attend, and also survey data can have issues about people reporting what they would like to think they did rather than necessarily what they actually did. And also a lot of the people studying cultural participation have been interested in social stratification, and so they tend to frame it as something that is dominated by class identification and by cultural capital. And certainly in my analysis of survey data, I have found that to be the case. However, this has caused policymakers to conclude that the level of supply of opportunities to participate in culture, i.e. where the theatres and concert halls are, actually makes little difference to participation levels. And this has led in some cases to disinvestment, i.e. ceasing to fund local cultural facilities, because participation is seen to be explained by social stratification and not by local access. So I analyse transactional, that is box office data from Scottish arts venues, many of them in Glasgow and Edinburgh, but also from Inverness and Aberdeen and Stirling and other parts of the country. I was able to show that, in fact, on this graph we can see the number of transactions in total for each venue within the period of study, and then the average number of kilometres that the registered home address of the attender lived away from the venue. And in fact there is an extremely steep distance decay after certainly the vast majority or the greatest likelihood of attending is from within about 16 kilometres. After that there's a very gradual tail off. So I was able to establish there is a significant distance decay, proximity to the venue in attendance, which does have implications in terms of thinking about local funding of arts venues. The fifth example I'm going to talk about now is Google flu trends, where Google themselves use the searches that people undertake using Google to predict flu trends. They started in 2009 with a big fanfare where they were very closely able to predict the registered number of flu outbreaks as recorded within the US by the Centre for Disease Control. But over a number of years, it became apparent that in fact they were very often over-predicting the number of cases of flu by, in some weeks, as much as 100%, i.e. they were predicting or estimating double the number of flu cases as there in fact had been. This was due in part to the fact that the searches seemed to be more closely related to fear of flu, to worry about whether people were catching flu rather than necessarily to actually actual cases of flu. And there are also many strong correlations with other seasonal issues, for example, high school basketball, so that some people had been led to question whether their flu trend was in fact a winter detector rather than a flu detector. So it's an interesting example of possibly one of the pitfalls of big data analysis. The last example I'm going to talk about here is use of Twitter data to look at the independence referendum. This was done by Anna Langer in the politics department, Michael Comerford in the Urban Big Data Centre, and Des McNulty in Policy Scotland. They're all part of the University of Glasgow. And they analysed the many millions of tweets that happened with a variety of independence campaign related hashtags during the independence referendum to understand the role of social media in political mobilisation. As you can see on the left, there's a visualization of I believe they're called ego nodes, of basically who UK Together were tweeting when they tweeted, and to what extent. You can see those are the lines going from UK Together in the centre to some of their other key collaborators, so to speak, the thickness of the lines indicating the number of the tweets that included those other Twitter handles within the tweets. And the size of the circle, the number of tweets that they themselves produced. And you can see there's also some thin lines going from the external nodes, so to speak, the secondary nodes, where they were tweeting one another without including UK together. Whereas you can see in Yes Scotland that there was, they had many more subnodes than UK together, and this is not including obviously every individual that might have been tweeting about the independence referendum, or even the more independent campaign groups, for example, Wings Over Scotland, who were not directly associated with the official campaign. So many more independent nodes in their network of tweets, and also much more likely to be tweeting one another without necessarily referring to the overall campaign. So I've given you, I hope, an interesting, very varied example of just some of the research studies that have taken place using different kinds of big data sets, most of them in Scotland, and I hope that's of interest.
Okay, good. So a recording there from Orian Brook on research applications using big data and research data relevant to the third sector. We've pretty much run out of time for this webinar, so we're going to wrap up swiftly. But whether you've been watching us live or whether you're watching a recording of this session, we do hope you've got some helpful things from it about aspects of data resources and research on civil society. And we hope you'll perhaps come or participate in or watch some of the other webinars associated with the Civil Society Data Partnership projects available from their website, thinkdata.org.uk.